If there were a proper strategy between the US, the UK, and allies, is that strategy that we want to destroy Huawei?
So let me kind of abstract from Huawei itself, because I think you have to take a couple of steps back. In a world of no trust, where you don't trust this behemoth of a trading partner at all, and you certainly are leery of its ideology and its underlying goals, what is the kind of trading architecture you could create for that? And I think that it involves thinking about what areas of your economy are critical such that you would not want to have any involvement from companies from that country. And I think it may well be that 5G is rightly on that side of the line. But I think what we haven't had is a kind of going through, what is included, what is critical, what is not critical. Is it okay to buy T-shirts from China? I assume so. What is it not okay to do?
Well, I mentioned the Huawei issue because, you said, well, maybe it's okay to sell T-shirts, presumably. Well, if Huawei's on the wrong side of the line and those T-shirts have chips in them, then it probably isn't, right? In the sense that anything...
If your argument is that having Huawei infrastructure in your 5G is dangerous because, it is unclear what they do. Some parts of it are made in China. It's going to become harder now. One part of the argument was that because of the recent US sanctions, the oversight of Huawei infrastructure that the UK had pioneered. The UK has, for the last few years, had this special office that essentially looks at all Huawei infrastructure to make sure that it is okay. That process of oversight has become much harder because of the US sanctions. So that's one argument, that you can no longer trust, you can no longer verify, and in the absence of trust, if you can't verify, it's too dangerous.
We convinced many countries, and I did this myself for the most part, not to use Huawei because we think it's an unsafe security risk.
But the second is that you have to think, well, what about, Microsoft or Apple, who's produces a huge amount in China? What is it? What can we actually produce there? If we can't have any form of integration, that involves a much, much greater decoupling, both of software and of hardware, than I think anybody has thought through, because the most extreme version is that you have to have two tech ecosystems, separate hardware, separate software companies, completely different. But even if you go down that route, then what do countries, the third-party countries, do if you're in Indonesia or in India or a Brazil?
Yeah, they'll have to choose. There's no question. But you put your finger on something we hadn't talked about yet, because we've been mostly framing this in terms of governments, but you mentioned Microsoft, you mentioned Apple. Do you see a sea change in the private sector, or do you think it's going to be much more divided over the coming years?
I think it's going to be more divided. I think it's going to depend on where your main markets are, on what you're doing, on how big and important the Chinese market is for you. So I think a conglomerate based in Asia will have a very different outlook to one based in the UK, certainly in the US. But I suspect that what we're seeing is the US itself is increasingly off limits to Chinese companies, I think, of all sorts, and that the US will be a sort of outlier. But the bit that will be tricky is what happens in Europe, what happens in Africa, what happens in the fast-growing emerging markets. If we're thinking, not 1 year, but 10 years, what are we trying to create here?